The first time my phone lit up with Ethan Caldwell's name that night, I let it ring. By the fifth call, I picked up just in time to hear panic in a man who once told me in front of a room full of people that I'd never afford his lifestyle. "What did you do, Cora?" he demanded. I didn't answer right away. I was still staring at the legal notice on my screen, the one confirming his investment project had just been frozen. Because of me. 3 days ago, I was the woman he publicly dismissed. Tonight, I was the reason his entire deal had stalled. And the truth? He had no idea how much worse it was about to get. If you're listening from somewhere out there, tell me where you're from and what time it is for you right now. I always wonder who's on the other side of these stories, and if you've ever been underestimated like this, you might want to stay. A year ago, I met Ethan Caldwell in a room full of people who measured each other before they even shook hands. It was a Thursday night in Manhattan, one of those invitation-only networking events where everyone pretended they weren't there to impress anyone. I had gone because my firm encouraged visibility. Financial compliance doesn't sound glamorous, but we sit quietly behind a lot of very expensive decisions. I remember standing near the bar, nursing a sparkling water, watching conversations that felt more like negotiations than introductions. That's when Marcus Hale found me. "Cora, right," he said, smiling like he already knew the answer. "You should meet someone." I should have said no. I didn't. Ethan was across the room mid-story, holding the attention of 3 people who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else but couldn't look away. He had that kind of presence. Controlled. Polished. Like he'd practiced every version of himself and settled on the one that worked best. Ethan Caldwell Marcus said, making the introduction. "Real estate." Ethan turned, and for a moment his expression softened like he was switching modes. "Cora Peterson," I said. "Peterson," he repeated, as if testing how it sounded next to his own name. "What do you do, Cora?" "Financial compliance." He tilted his head slightly. "So you're the one who tells people like me what we can't do?" "Sometimes," I said. "More often I explain why it matters." He smiled at that. Not politely, interestingly. For the next 20 minutes, he asked questions that felt thoughtful at first. Where I worked, what I specialized in, how long I'd been in the field. But gradually the tone shifted. The questions became comparisons. What kind of clients do you usually deal with? What's the largest deal you've reviewed? Do you ever think about moving into something more scalable? I recognized the pattern. It wasn't curiosity. It was positioning. Still, I didn't leave. There was something compelling about him, not just the confidence, but the certainty. Ethan spoke like someone who had already decided what mattered and wasn't interested in reconsidering it. At some point, he waved over the bartender and ordered 2 drinks without asking what I wanted. Whiskey for himself. Something lighter for me. "You'll like it," he said. I took a sip. It was expensive. Balanced. Carefully chosen. "See," he said. "You just need to trust the right people." That line stayed with me longer than it should have. We started seeing each other after that. Not immediately. Ethan didn't chase in the obvious way he curated. Dinners at places that didn't have menus online. Last-minute reservations that somehow always worked out. Invitations to events where I felt slightly underdressed no matter how carefully I planned. The first time he paid for everything without even glancing at the bill, I thanked him. He shrugged. "I'm used to it." There was no arrogance in his tone. That was what made it harder to question. It sounded like a fact, not a flex. Over the next few weeks, I noticed something else. Ethan talked about money constantly, but never directly. It was always framed as lifestyle. Standards. Access. "You can tell a lot about someone by what they're willing to settle for," he said once, as we left a restaurant because he didn't like the table they offered us. Another time, he looked at my apartment, small, clean, practical, and said, "It's efficient." I knew what that meant. "I like it," I said. "I'm sure you do," he replied, not unkindly. "But you won't forever." I should have pushed back harder. I didn't. Instead, I explained about stability, about choosing predictability over risk, about how compliance work wasn't flashy, but it mattered. It protected people from making decisions they'd regret later. He listened. Or at least he looked like he did. "You're smart, Cora," he said one night, walking me to my door. "You just think too small." There it was. Not an insult. Not exactly. But something in me shifted when he said it. Like a quiet line had been drawn, and I had just stepped onto the side where I needed to prove something. "I don't think small," I said. "I think carefully." Ethan smiled, that same measured expression I'd seen the first night. "Careful doesn't build empires." I didn't answer, because part of me, an uncomfortable, honest part, wondered if he was right. That was the beginning, not the relationship itself. That came easily. It was the beginning of the imbalance. The slow, almost invisible way I started explaining my choices more than I should have. The way I found myself justifying a career I had been proud of for years. The way his world began to feel like a standard I hadn't realized I was being measured against. And the most dangerous part, he never raised his voice. He never said anything outright cruel. He just positioned me lower, quieter, slightly behind. So when he later asked me to build something together, it didn't feel like a risk. It felt like a chance to catch up. I didn't realize then that he had already decided what role I was supposed to play in that plan. And I definitely didn't realize how carefully he had designed it. The first time he mentioned the investment, it sounded almost casual. "We should talk about doing something together," he said, as if it had just occurred to him. I remember looking at him, trying to read whether this was about us or about something else entirely. What kind of something, I asked. He held my gaze for a second longer than usual, the kind that changes everything. At the time, I thought he meant our future. I didn't yet understand he was talking about leverage. The first time I drove up to the Caldwell house in Connecticut, I almost turned around. It wasn't just the size of it, though. The house itself looked like something pulled out of a magazine I didn't subscribe to. It was the way everything around it felt. Curated, the long driveway, the trimmed hedges, the quiet. Nothing out of place, nothing accidental. Ethan didn't seem to notice. He parked, stepped out, and walked ahead like he belonged there, which of course he did. "You're going to be fine," he said over his shoulder, like he'd already anticipated my hesitation. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. That should have bothered me more than it did. Inside the house was even more precise. Neutral tones, clean lines, expensive without being loud about it. The kind of place where you automatically lowered your voice without knowing why. His mother, Elaine Caldwell, greeted us first. She smiled at Ethan. Then she looked at me. Not unkindly, just carefully. "So this is Cora," she said. "Not nice to meet you. Not we've heard so much about you. Just a statement." "Yes," I said, offering my hand. She shook it lightly, already turning back to Ethan. "Dinner's almost ready." His father, Richard Caldwell, joined us a few minutes later in the living room. He had the same controlled presence as Ethan, but heavier. Less charm, more expectation. "Cora," he said, nodding once. "Ethan mentioned you work in compliance." I do." He sat across from me, studying me the way someone studies numbers that don't quite add up. "That's stable work," he said. I recognized the phrasing immediately. "Yes," I said. "It is." He leaned back slightly. "And long term. Do you see yourself staying in that lane?" Ethan was quiet beside me, not distracted. listening. "I like what I do," I said. "It's meaningful." Richard didn't respond right away. He just gave a small nod like he was acknowledging the answer without accepting it. Dinner was served in a room that felt too formal for the way we were sitting. The conversation moved easily if you ignored what was actually being said. Elaine asked about my background, where I went to school, how long I'd been in my field, what my trajectory looked like. Every question sounded polite. Every answer felt evaluated. At one point, she smiled at me and said, "It must be nice to have something predictable." I met her gaze. "It is." Ethan shifted slightly in his chair. Richard set his fork down. "Predictability has its place," he said, "but it rarely creates opportunity." There it was again. Not a direct criticism, just a framework where I didn't quite fit. I could feel the shape of it forming the way they categorized people: builders, leaders, investors, and then everyone else. "Cora's very detail-oriented," Ethan said suddenly. It sounded like a compliment. It landed like a label, Elaine nodded. "That's important, especially in supportive roles." Supportive. I didn't correct her. I told myself it wasn't worth it, that this was just one dinner, that Ethan would balance it later. He didn't. After dinner, we stepped outside onto the patio. The air was cooler, quieter away from the house. "You handled that well," Ethan said. "Handled what?" He glanced back toward the dining room. "My parents. I wasn't aware I was being tested." He gave a small smile. "Everyone gets evaluated at some point. I'm not applying for a position, Ethan." "Not officially," he said. I looked at him then. Really looked. "Did you agree with them? With what? That I don't create opportunity?" He didn't answer immediately, and that pause told me more than anything he could have said. I think he said finally, "You've chosen a path that limits your upside." There it was. Clearer this time, less polished. "I chose a path that makes sense to me, and that's fine," he said quickly. "I'm just saying, if we're building something together, you might need to think bigger." We. That word should have felt reassuring. It didn't. "What does building something actually mean to you?" I asked. Ethan leaned against the railing, looking out over the yard like he was already picturing it. "Investment," he said, "scale, leverage, not just earning money, making it work." I crossed my arms slightly. "And where do I fit into that?" He turned back to me. "You bring stability," he said. "Structure. Credibility." Something in my chest tightened. "And you?" I asked. "I bring growth." It sounded so reasonable, so balanced, until you looked at it closely. Stability, growth. One holds things in place. The other moves forward. Only one of those gets credit for expansion. "You're asking me to change," I said. "I'm asking you to evolve." There it was again. That quiet reframing that made resistance sound like weakness. "I don't need to be fixed," I said. I didn't say you did, but he didn't deny it either. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The space between us felt different now. Not broken, just clearer. Ethan exhaled softly like he was recalibrating. "Look," he said, "I'm serious about you, Cora. I wouldn't have brought you here if I wasn't. I know, and I see potential, more than what you're doing right now." That should have felt like belief. It didn't. It felt like expectation. We went back inside after that. The rest of the evening passed without incident. Polite conversation, careful smiles, controlled exits. On the drive back, Ethan reached over and took my hand. "You're overthinking it," he said. "I'm thinking exactly as much as I need to." He squeezed my hand lightly. "Trust me." There it was again. Trust the right people. I stared out the window, watching the dark stretch of road ahead. About what I asked, Ethan's grip tightened just slightly. That I know what I'm doing. I didn't respond, because somewhere quietly, a different question had already started forming in my mind. Not whether I trusted him, but whether he needed me to trust him more than he deserved. And I didn't realize it yet, but that question was about to matter a lot sooner than I expected. A few days later, he brought it up again. Not as a conversation this time, as an opportunity. Ethan didn't bring up the investment like it was a risk. He presented it like it was already decided and I was just catching up to it. We were at a restaurant in Midtown, one of those places where the lighting is low enough to make everything feel more important than it actually is. He had chosen the table. He had ordered the wine. He had already set the tone before I even sat down. I've been reviewing a project, he said, sliding his phone across the table. I glanced at the screen renderings of a modern mixed-use building, numbers layered over images, projected returns highlighted in bold. It's in Brooklyn, he continued. Up-and-coming area. Early entry, strong upside. I didn't touch the phone. Looks expensive, I said. He smiled slightly. That's the point. There was a pause just long enough for him to let the silence do its work. I want you in on it, he added. I looked up at him. In what sense? As a partner? The word landed heavier than it should have. Partner, I repeated. Legally or financially for now, he said smoothly. Legally, once we formalize everything else. Everything else. He didn't say marriage, but it was implied. Positioned. Waiting. I leaned back slightly. What exactly are you asking me to do? Ethan rested his elbows lightly on the table, lowering his voice not to hide but to control the moment. I've already structured most of it, he said, but bringing in additional capital now strengthens our position. Better leverage, better terms. Our position. I held on to that phrasing. And my role, I asked. You contribute capital, he said. You benefit from the returns. Simple, simple. Nothing about it sounded simple. How much capital, I asked. He named a number. I didn't react immediately, but something inside me shifted. It wasn't just the amount. It was the assumption that I could or would commit it without hesitation. That's not a small ask, Ethan. It's not a small opportunity either. There it was again. The reframing. Risk turned into privilege. I took a slow breath. I'd need to review everything, thoroughly. Of course, he said quickly. Too quickly. I mean it, I added. All of it. Structure, ownership, liability. Ethan nodded, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. I already have legal drafting in place, he said. We can go over it together, or I can have someone review it independently. That landed differently. For a moment he didn't respond. Then he smiled. You don't trust me. It wasn't an accusation. It was softer than that. Worse in a way. I trust that you believe in what you're doing, I said carefully. That's not the same as understanding every implication. He studied me for a second longer than usual. You're cautious, he said. I'm thorough. Sometimes those look the same, he replied. I didn't argue. Because sometimes they do. A few days later, I sat across from his attorney, Howard Blake, in a glass-walled office that overlooked the city like it was part of the presentation. Blake walked me through the documents with practiced ease. He explained structure, projected returns, timelines. Everything sounded clean, efficient, almost too clean. This entity, I said, pointing to a section, is fully controlled by Ethan's holding company. Yes, Blake replied. For operational consistency. And my contribution, documented as capital injection. You receive proportional financial benefit. Without ownership is indirect, he he said. That word again. Indirect. I glanced at Ethan. He didn't look concerned. It's standard, Ethan said. For this stage. I nodded slowly, flipping through the pages. There were a lot of them. Most people wouldn't read them. That thought lingered longer than it should have. I'd like a copy, I said. Blake smiled. Of course. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly. Take your time, he added. But the way he said it made it clear that time had a limit. That night back at the apartment, Ethan poured himself a drink and leaned against the counter. You went quiet in there, he said. I was thinking. About what I set the folder down on the table between us. About structure, I said. About control. Ethan exhaled softly. Cora, this is how these deals work. Some deals I corrected. He watched me carefully now. You're overcomplicating it. Or I'm seeing something you don't want to explain. That shifted the air. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan straightened slightly, his tone tightening, not aggressive, but firmer. This is an opportunity, he said. For both of us. On your terms. On effective terms. I held his gaze. And if I'm not comfortable with those terms, Ethan didn't answer right away. He walked over, picked up the folder, and tapped it lightly against his palm. Then you walk away from something bigger than what you've built so far, he said. There it was. Not pressure, just consequence, carefully framed. I nodded slowly. I'll review it, I said. Ethan studied me for a moment, then gave a small, satisfied nod. Good. That night after he went to bed, I sat alone at the table. The apartment was quiet. The folder was still in front of me. I opened it again this time, without conversation, without interruption, without someone guiding my attention away from what mattered. Page by page, line by line. And somewhere between the legal language and the footnotes, something didn't sit right. Not obvious, not dramatic, just off. I closed the folder and reached for my phone. There was one person I trusted to look at this without bias. Someone who didn't care about Ethan's confidence, or his vision, or his version of the story. I sent the file, and within an hour I got a response. Cora, we need to talk. I stared at the message longer than I should have, because I already knew what it meant. Not that something was wrong, but that something was intentionally hidden, and I had just stepped into it. Ms. Diane Reynolds didn't waste time on small talk. When I walked into her office the next morning, she was already seated, a printed copy of the contract in front of her, marked, tabbed, and annotated in a way that immediately made my stomach tighten. Sit, she said, not unkindly, just focused. I did. For a second, neither of us spoke. She studied me the way someone studies a decision they already know you've made but are about to question anyway. How well do you trust him? She asked. Not, do you trust him? How well? That depends on what we're about to discuss, I said. She gave a small nod like that was the right answer. Good, she said, because you shouldn't sign anything else until you understand exactly what this is. She turned the contract toward me and tapped a section halfway through. On the surface, this looks like a standard capital contribution agreement, she said. You provide funds, you receive a financial return tied to project performance. That's what he said. Yes, she replied. That's what it's designed to look like. My chest tightened slightly. And what is it actually? I asked. She flipped to another page, this one marked with a bright tab. This clause here, she said. Section 7.3. It's buried, but it's the most important part of the entire document. I leaned forward. It was dense. Legal language layered over itself in a way that almost discouraged reading. Translate it for me, I said. Reynolds didn't hesitate. It gives you conditional authority over certain disbursements and structural changes within the project entity. I blinked. That doesn't sound like I have no control. You don't, she said calmly. Not directly. But in specific scenarios, funding releases, refinancing, external partnerships, your signature becomes necessary. I sat back slightly, trying to piece it together. So, I'm not an owner, I said slowly, but I can block certain actions. Yes, and he knows that. Reynolds met my eyes. Of course he knows that. The room felt quieter than it should have. Then why structure it this way, I asked. She leaned back in her chair. Because it allows him to present control while still using your financial profile and legal standing to strengthen the project. My legal standing. You work in compliance, she said. Your name carries weight in certain regulatory contexts. It makes the project look cleaner, safer. Cleaner, safer. But I don't actually have decision-making power unless something specific happens, I said. Correct. And those specific situations, they're not random. No, she said. They're predictable. I looked down at the contract again this time, seeing it differently. This wasn't about partnership, I said quietly. No, Reynolds replied. It was about leverage. The word landed heavier than I expected. I sat there for a moment, letting that settle. And the risk, I asked. She didn't soften it. You're financially exposed, she said. Your capital is tied in. If the project fails, you absorb losses without control over how decisions are made. And if it succeeds, you benefit, she said, but not proportionally to your risk. I let out a slow breath. That sounds intentional. It is. Silence stretched between us. Not uncomfortable. Just clear. So what are my options, I asked. Reynolds closed the folder gently. That depends on what you want. I want to understand what he's doing, I said. You already do. No, I said, shaking my head slightly. I understand the structure. I don't understand the intention. Reynolds studied me for a moment. He wants to scale, she said. Quickly, efficiently, using every available advantage. And I'm one of those advantages. Yes. I nodded slowly. Does he think I won't notice? Reynolds didn't answer that directly. He's relying on timing, she said instead. Momentum. The assumption that you'll trust the relationship enough not to question the details. I thought back to every conversation, every time he'd reframed something, every time he'd made hesitation sound like fear. That tracks, I said quietly. Reynolds folded her hands on the desk. You have 3 options, she said. Walk away, confront him, or continue. Continue, I repeated. With awareness, she clarified. You proceed as if you don't see the imbalance. You gather information. You protect yourself. And when the timing is right, you act. I held her gaze. That sounds like a long game. It is. And risky. Yes, but effective. I looked down at the contract again, at the clauses, at the structure that had been designed to look simple. Would you do it? I asked. Reynolds didn't hesitate. If I had the patience, she said, and if I was certain I could stay objective. I let that sit. Because that was the real question. Not whether I could understand the situation, but whether I could stay in it long enough to change it. What would I need to do? I asked. Her expression shifted slightly, less analysis, more strategy. Document everything she said. Every conversation. Every email. Every transaction. I nodded. Don't challenge him prematurely, she continued. Let him believe you're aligned. And the contract, sign it, she said. I looked up at her. Are you serious? Yes, she said. Because that clause, it's your leverage. Without it, you have nothing. I felt something shift in me then. Not fear, not anger, clarity. So I step into the structure, I said slowly, but I don't play the role he expects. Exactly. Silence settled again. Different this time. More focused. All right, I said finally. Reynolds nodded once, like the decision had just locked into place. One more thing, she added. What timing matters, she said. You don't act when you're ready. You act when he isn't. I almost smiled, because for the first time since this started, I didn't feel behind. I felt positioned. That night when Ethan asked if I'd made a decision, I didn't hesitate. I'm in, I said. Relief crossed his face, subtle but real. Good, he said. I knew you'd see it. I held his gaze. I see more than you think. He smiled like that was a compliment, and for now I let him believe that's all it was. But as I stood there, something else settled into place. Not just understanding, control. Because for the first time, I wasn't reacting to what Ethan was building. I was watching it, and I knew exactly where the pressure points were. The only question left was when to use them. A week later, I got my answer, when an email came through that wasn't meant to include me. The email came in at 11:42 p.m. I almost didn't open it. By that point, I had already trained myself to move carefully, no sudden reactions, no visible shifts. Ethan was in the next room on a call he didn't bother to lower his voice for. I had learned to read tone without hearing every word, but this one stood out. Not because of the subject line, it was generic enough, updated structure. Phase 2. It was the CC list. My name was there. Last. Almost like an afterthought. I clicked. The thread was already long. Multiple replies between Ethan and someone named Liam Foster, the same partner I'd seen mentioned briefly during earlier conversations. The kind of name that only showed up when things were already in motion. I scrolled past the top messages first. That's a habit I've always had, start from the bottom where people forget to filter themselves. The most recent message was from Liam. We can't proceed with the next tranche until her authorization is in place. If compliance flags this later, it complicates everything. I read that line twice. Her authorization. Not optional. Not symbolic. Necessary. My fingers hovered over the screen as I scrolled up further. Ethan's reply came earlier that evening. She'll sign. Don't overthink it. She's not focused on this level of detail. I didn't feel anger immediately. What I felt first was confirmation. Not of the structure, that part I already understood, but of his assumption. That I wasn't looking closely enough. That I didn't need to. That I wouldn't. I kept reading. Liam again. It's not about her understanding. It's about exposure. If something gets audited, Ethan cut him off in the next message. Then we handle it. That's why she's involved in the first place. I stopped scrolling. That line sat heavier than everything else. Not because it was surprising, but because it was precise. That's why she's involved. Not as a partner. Not as someone building something together. As a buffer. A layer between the structure and the consequences. I set my phone down slowly, staring at the table for a moment longer than necessary. In the other room, Ethan laughed low, controlled, confident. The same way he always did when he thought he had already accounted for every variable. I picked the phone back up, scrolled again, this time more carefully. There were attachments, updated documents, revised timelines, internal projections. I downloaded everything without opening them immediately, then I checked the timestamps. The changes had been made after I signed, after the structure was finalized. That mattered. A lot. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water I didn't really need. Ethan's voice carried faintly through the wall. "Yeah, we're closing soon," he said. "Everything's lined up. Everything. Except me." I went back to the table and opened the first attachment. It was a revised disbursement schedule. Nothing unusual at first glance. Until I noticed the sequencing. Funds moving through intermediary accounts before reaching their final destination. Not illegal by itself, but unnecessary given the structure they had already set up. Unnecessary meant intentional, and intentional meant there was a reason it wasn't simplified. I pulled up the contract I had signed. Section 7.3, the clause Reynolds had pointed out, conditional authority, triggered under specific circumstances. I cross-referenced the schedule with the clause, line by line. It didn't take long. There it was, the moment where my authorization became required right before the largest transfer in the entire structure. Not at the beginning, not at the end. Right at the point where everything shifted from reversible to permanent. I leaned back in my chair, letting that settle. I hadn't just included me, he had positioned me, exactly where he needed a layer of legitimacy, and exactly where he assumed I wouldn't look. I picked up my phone again and took screenshots, saved the attachments, forwarded everything to a secure folder Reynolds had set up for me. Documentation. That was the first step. Always. I didn't confront him. Not that night. Instead, I closed the files, locked my phone, and sat there until Ethan walked back into the room. He looked relaxed, satisfied. "Still up?" he asked. "Couldn't sleep," I said. He nodded, pouring himself another drink. "Big week coming up," he added. "Closing soon." I watched him for a second. "Do you need anything from me?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "Not yet," he said. "I'll let you know." Of course he would. At exactly the moment he needed that signature. I nodded slowly. "Okay." He smiled like everything was still moving exactly as planned. And in a way it was, just not in the direction he thought. That night I didn't sleep much, not because I was overwhelmed, but because everything had finally aligned. The structure, the intention, the timing. All the pieces were there now, clear enough to act, but not yet. Reynolds had been right. You don't move when you're ready. You move when they are. And Ethan was getting close, closer than he realized. The next morning I got a calendar invite. Subject line: final authorization, funding release. No explanation, no discussion, just a time, and my name on the required attendee list. I stared at it for a long moment before accepting, because I already knew what that meeting was for, and I knew exactly what I was going to do. I just hadn't decided how far I was willing to take it. The engagement party was Ethan's idea. Of course it was. He chose the venue, a private ballroom in a hotel that didn't advertise its event space online. The kind of place where everything felt controlled before you even walked in. Lighting softened, music curated, conversations filtered. It was less a celebration and more a presentation. I arrived 10 minutes after Ethan deliberately. Not late enough to draw attention, just late enough to observe. The room was already full. Investors, family, friends, people who spoke in low tones and measured eye contact. I recognized a few faces from earlier meetings, Liam Foster among them, standing near the bar, scanning the room like he was keeping track of moving parts. Ethan spotted me almost immediately. "There you are," he said, stepping forward with that same practiced warmth. He kissed my cheek lightly, his hand settling at my back like it belonged there. "You look perfect," I smiled. Not because I felt it, but because it was expected. "Thank you." He guided me into the room, introducing me again to people I had already met. "This is Cora," he said. "My fiancé." There was always a pause after that, a small one, almost invisible, but I felt it every time. We moved through the room like that for the first half hour. Controlled conversations, polite laughter, subtle positioning. I watched more than I spoke, watched who deferred to Ethan, watched who questioned him, watched who didn't. Liam caught my eye once, just for a second. Then he looked away. That told me enough. Dinner began shortly after. Speeches followed. Ethan went last. Of course he did. He stood at the center of the room, glass in hand, posture relaxed but intentional. He knew exactly how to hold attention without asking for it. I want to thank everyone for being here, he began. For the support, the trust, the shared vision. His eyes moved across the room, landing on familiar faces, reinforcing connections without naming them. Then they landed on me. And I want to say something about Cora. The room shifted subtly but noticeably. I felt it before he even continued. She's different from what I'm used to, he said, smiling slightly. A few quiet laughs. I didn't move. She's careful, he went on, thoughtful, grounded. Each word sounded like a compliment. Each one felt like a boundary. And honestly, he added, that's been an adjustment. More laughter this time. Softer. More comfortable. I could feel people leaning into it, waiting for the part where it turned fully warm. It didn't. But I think that's what makes this, he said, because not everyone needs to lead. There it was. Clear enough that I didn't have to interpret it. Subtle enough that no one could call it out. A few people nodded. Elaine Caldwell smiled into her glass. Richard didn't react at all. And let's be real. Ethan continued, his tone lightening just slightly. This world, it's not for everyone. He looked directly at me. But she's here, he said. Learning, adapting, learning, adapting. As if I had been invited into something above my level, as if my presence required permission. I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger, not even embarrassment, just clarity. He raised his glass. To building something bigger than ourselves. People echoed it. Glasses lifted. The moment moved forward. I didn't. Because for the first time, I wasn't inside the moment. I was outside it, watching, measuring, deciding. Ethan sat back down beside me, his expression relaxed, satisfied. You okay? He asked quietly. I'm fine, I said. He studied me for a second like he was checking for cracks. There weren't any. Because I had already stepped out of the version of myself he was speaking to. The rest of the night blurred slightly. Conversations continued. Music shifted. People moved between groups, reinforcing whatever connections they needed to maintain. I didn't confront him. Not there. Not in that room. Because that wasn't the point. When we got back to the apartment later, the silence felt different. Not tense. Just stripped of performance. Ethan loosened his tie, poured himself a drink, leaned against the counter like he always did. You were quiet tonight, he said. I was listening. To what? To you. He smiled faintly, and I met his eyes. You meant what you said. It wasn't a question. He held my gaze for a second longer than usual. I always do. That was the problem. I nodded slowly. Good, I said. He looked slightly relieved, like he had expected resistance that didn't come. I'm glad you understand, he added. I didn't correct him, because understanding and agreement weren't the same thing. He walked over, set his glass down, reached for my hand. We're close, Cora, he said. Everything's lining up. I let him take my hand. Yeah, I said quietly. It is. And for the first time, that statement belonged to me more than it did to him. He didn't notice. He went to bed shortly after, like the night had confirmed everything he needed it to. I stayed up. Not because I was upset, but because I needed the silence. I sat at the table, opened my laptop, and pulled up the files again. The contract, the emails, the revised disbursement schedule. Then I opened the calendar invite for the next morning. Final authorization, funding release. Required attendee Cora Peterson. I stared at that line for a long moment. Then I opened a new email. To Diane Reynolds. Subject tomorrow. I didn't write much. Just enough. He's ready. Her reply came faster than I expected. Then you move. I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark, letting that settle. Because this was the moment everything shifted. Not emotionally, practically, legally, irreversibly. The next morning I got dressed without rushing. No hesitation. No second guessing. When I stepped into that meeting, I wasn't going to be the person Ethan had introduced to that room. I was going to be the one he hadn't accounted for, and he still didn't see it coming. The conference room was already set when I arrived. Glass walls, neutral tones, a long table with neatly arranged documents at each seat, even though most of it was digital. It was the kind of space designed to make decisions feel inevitable. Ethan was there first. Of course he was. He stood near the window, phone in hand, speaking quietly, but when he saw me, he ended the call immediately. "You're right on time," he said, like this was just another step in a process we both agreed on. I replied. Liam Foster sat at the far end of the table, laptop open, already pulled into whatever version of this meeting he had prepared for himself. He gave me a brief nod, nothing more. There were two other people I hadn't met before, legal and financial, based on the way they carried themselves. Focused, detached, not invested in the outcome, only the structure. Diane Reynolds arrived last. She didn't rush, didn't announce herself. She simply walked in, placed her folder on the table, and sat beside me. Ethan's expression shifted for just a second. "You brought counsel," he said. "I did," I replied. A pause. "Not long, but enough." "That wasn't necessary," he added. "It is for me." Reynolds didn't speak. She didn't need to. The meeting began without formal introductions. Liam took the lead, pulling up the final disbursement schedule on the screen. "As you all know," he said, "we're at the final stage before funding release. Once authorized, we move forward with Phase 2 and lock in external capital." He glanced at Ethan briefly, then continued. "We just need final signatures." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. The documents were passed down the table. I didn't pick mine up right away. Instead, I looked at Ethan. "You said everything was lined up," I said. "It is," he replied smoothly. "This is just the last formality." Formality. I nodded once, then turned to the document. Same structure, same language, but updated. I could see it immediately, the revised sequencing, the additional clauses tied to disbursement timing. They thought I wouldn't notice. Or worse, they thought it didn't matter if I did. I flipped to section 7.3, then to the disbursement schedule, then back again. Reynolds leaned slightly closer, her voice low enough that only I could hear it. "They're moving faster than expected," she said. "I know." Ethan watched me from across the table. "You have questions?" he asked. I looked up. "Yes," I said. The room shifted, subtle but real. What kind of questions Liam asked? "About the sequencing," I said, tapping the page lightly. "Why funds are routed through intermediary accounts before final allocation." Silence. Not confusion. Calculation. "That's standard structuring," Ethan said. "Not for this type of project," I replied. He smiled slightly. You're overanalyzing it. There it was again. Same tone. Same dismissal. But this time, it landed differently. I turned a page. And this clause I continued. The one requiring my authorization before the second tranche. That's already been explained, Ethan said. Not fully, I replied. Reynolds spoke for the first time. It hasn't, she said calmly. Not in a way that reflects the actual risk distribution. Now the room changed. Not just tension. Awareness. Liam sat up slightly. What are you implying? He asked. I'm not implying anything I said. I'm clarifying. I slid the document slightly forward. This structure places my capital at risk without proportional control, but it also requires my authorization at a critical point in the funding sequence. I paused, letting that settle, which means I continued. I have the ability to delay or prevent that release. Ethan's expression didn't break, but it tightened. That's not how this works, he said. It is, Reynolds replied. Legally. Silence again. He looked at me now not like before, not assessing, not guiding, recalculating. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be, he said. No, I said quietly. I'm making it accurate. Liam closed his laptop halfway. This isn't productive, he said. We're here to finalize. And I am finalizing, I replied. I picked up the pen. Not to sign, just to hold. I'm not authorizing this release, I said. The words landed clean. No hesitation, no emotion, just fact. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Cora, he said, his voice lower now, controlled. This isn't the time for this. It's exactly the time. You're putting the entire deal at risk. I met his eyes. You already did that. That was the first moment something cracked. Not loudly, not visibly to everyone, but I saw it. Because for the first time, he didn't have a response ready. Liam exhaled sharply. What do you want? He asked. Straight to it. No more framing. No more positioning. Just terms. I set the pen down. Full transparency, I said. Revised structure. Direct ownership proportional to my capital. And removal of intermediary routing that exposes me without necessity. Ethan shook his head slightly. That's not how this deal was built. No, I said. It's how it continues. Reynolds slid a document across the table. Prepared. Already structured. You have options, she said calmly. You can proceed under revised terms, or you can pause and address the audit risk created by the current structure. Audit. That word shifted everything. Liam's expression changed first, then the others, because now this wasn't just negotiation, it was exposure. Ethan looked at me. Really looked this time. You planned this, he said. I didn't answer, because he already knew. The room was quiet now, not controlled, not curated, real. And for the first time since I met him, Ethan wasn't leading it. He was reacting. He leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose. If we stop now, he said, we lose investor confidence. If you continue like this, I replied, you risk more than confidence. Another pause. Longer this time. He glanced at Liam, at the others, at the documents in front of him, and then back at me. The balance had shifted, not emotionally, not dramatically, just structurally. Exactly where it mattered. I need a minute, he said finally. He stood, stepped away from the table, pulling Liam with him. They moved to the far side of the room, voices low, urgent. I didn't watch them. I didn't need to, because for the first time the outcome didn't depend on whether I was heard. It depended on whether they could afford to ignore me, and they couldn't. A few minutes later, Ethan turned back toward the table. Different now. Not defeated, but not in control either. "We'll review the revisions," he said. Not a question, not a challenge. A shift. I nodded once. Good. Because this wasn't about winning, it was about changing the terms, and that had already happened. But as the meeting continued, one thing became clear. Ethan wasn't done. Not even close, and whatever came next wasn't going to stay inside that room. Ethan didn't call me after the meeting. Not that day, not that night. That was the first real sign that something had changed. Before he would have reached out immediately, reframed the situation, softened it, redirected it. He was good at that, at turning tension into something manageable. This time there was silence, deliberate, measured. I didn't break it. 3 days later, Reynolds called me. "They're ready to talk," she said. About the revisions, about everything. The meeting was scheduled at a different office. Not the polished conference room from before. This one was smaller, less curated, functional. That mattered. It meant control had shifted not just legally, but psychologically. When I walked in, Ethan was already there. No audience this time, just him, his attorney Reynolds, and me. He looked tired. Not physically exactly, but the precision was gone. The careful control he carried in public settings had loosened. "Cora," he said. No smile, no performance. I nodded once. "Ethan." We sat. No one rushed to fill the silence. For a moment, it felt like we were both recalibrating not the deal, but the version of each other we were dealing with now. His attorney spoke first. "We've reviewed your proposed revisions," he said. "There are elements we can work with. Others are more complicated." "That's expected," Reynolds replied. Ethan didn't look at his attorney. He looked at me. "You could have come to me directly," he said. There it was. Not anger, disappointment, or something that wanted to sound like it. "I did," I said. "Multiple times. That's not what I mean." "I know." Silence again. "You escalated it," he said. I clarified it. His jaw tightened slightly. "You froze the deal." I paused something that wasn't structured fairly. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "For you," he said. "It wasn't fair for you." I held his gaze. "That's enough." He looked away for a second like he was deciding how far to push. "You knew what you were getting into," he said. "No," I replied calmly. "I knew what you told me I was getting into." That landed. His attorney shifted slightly but didn't interrupt. "Intent matters, Ethan," I continued. "Structure matters more." Reynolds didn't need to add anything. The documents on the table spoke for themselves. The emails, the timeline, the revisions made after I signed. Everything aligned. Ethan leaned forward again, elbows on the table, hands clasped. "What do you actually want?" he asked. Not rhetorically this time. Not strategically. Directly. I didn't rush the answer, because this was the moment that defined everything that came after. "I want out," I said. The room stilled. Not surprised. Just final. Ethan's eyes flickered just for the second. "You want to walk away from the deal. I want to exit cleanly," I said. "With my capital returned plus the agreed interim gains. No continued liability. No future attachment to the structure." His attorney spoke quietly. "That's not standard at this stage." No, Reynolds replied. But neither was the original structure. Ethan didn't look at either of them. He looked at me. "You'd walk away from this?" he asked. "Yes." After everything we built, I held his gaze. "You built it," I said. I was placed into it. That was the first time something real showed in his expression. Not control, not calculation, recognition of what this actually was. "You could have been part of something bigger," he said. "I still can," I replied. "Just not this." Silence stretched again, longer this time, because now there was no version of this conversation that returned us to where we had been, only forward or apart. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, something I had never seen him do before. Small, but telling. "If I agree to this," he said slowly, "you walk away. Completely. Yes, no future claims. No involvement. None." He nodded once like he was locking it in. "And the notice withdrawn upon settlement," Reynolds said. Another pause. Then Ethan leaned back, looking up at the ceiling for a second before returning his focus to the table. "Fine," he said. "Just one word." But it shifted everything. His attorney looked at him surprised. "You're sure he asked?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Yes." Reynolds nodded once. "Then we'll draft the agreement." The tension in the room eased, but not in a way that felt like relief. More like resolution. The kind that comes when there's nothing left to negotiate emotionally. Only terms. As the attorneys began outlining next steps, Ethan stayed quiet. He didn't try to reframe it. Didn't try to pull me back in. And that told me more than anything he could have said. Because for the first time, he wasn't trying to win me over. He was trying to limit the loss. When the meeting ended, we stood at the same time. There was a moment, brief, unspoken, where it could have turned into something else. An apology. A justification. Something. It didn't. "You surprised me," he said finally. "I know. That wasn't how I saw this going. It wasn't how you planned it." He nodded once. "That's true." I picked up my bag. "You'll get what you want," he said. "From the deal." I looked at him. I already did. He didn't ask what I meant. Maybe he understood. Maybe he didn't. It didn't matter anymore. I walked out of that office without looking back. Not because I was trying to prove something, but because there was nothing left behind that belonged to me. The paperwork would follow, the money would settle, the structure would adjust. But the real shift had already happened. Quietly. Irreversibly. And as I stepped outside into the late afternoon light, there was only one thought that stayed with me. Not about Ethan, not about the deal, but about something simpler, clearer, stronger. I hadn't taken anything from him. I had just stopped letting him define what I was worth. 6 months later, I stopped checking my phone every time it buzzed. That was how I knew something had actually changed. Not the kind of change you announce. The kind you notice in small absences, no hesitation before opening your inbox, no second-guessing a decision after you've already made it. My life didn't look dramatically different from the outside. Same city, same role in compliance, same steady rhythm that Ethan once described as too small. But the way I moved through it had shifted. At work, I started taking on cases I would have passed to someone else before. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because I trusted my judgment more than I used to. I spoke up earlier in meetings, asked harder questions, pushed back when something didn't sit right, and people noticed. Not in a loud way, just enough. "Good catch, my manager," said one afternoon after I flagged a structural issue in a client's reporting model. "That could have turned into something bigger." I nodded. I knew exactly how big those things could get. The settlement with Ethan closed quietly. No headlines, no public fallout, just documents signed, funds transferred, and a clean separation that looked almost uneventful on paper. I got my capital back along with a portion of the interim gains, enough to reflect the actual value I had contributed, not the version that had been assigned to me. Ethan kept the project, or at least the version of it that still existed after the restructuring. I heard through industry contacts that the deal went forward, but slower, more scrutinized. Investors asked more questions. Some pulled out. Others stayed, but with conditions. Nothing collapsed, but nothing moved the way he originally planned either. That felt accurate. Not revenge, just consequence. The last time I saw Ethan was 2 weeks after the settlement. By accident. A hotel lobby in downtown Chicago. I was there for a compliance conference. He was meeting someone I didn't ask who. We saw each other at the same time. For a second, it felt like stepping into a version of the past that no longer fit. "Cora," he said. No tension, no urgency, just recognition. "Ethan." We stood there not quite sure what came next. He looked the same mostly, still composed, still precise. But there was something else under it now, less certainty. "How have you been?" he asked. "Good," I said. "Busy." He nodded. "I've heard." That didn't surprise me. Information travels in his world, and you, I asked, working through things he said. It was the closest thing to honesty I had heard from him without framing. We stood there a moment longer. Then he said, "You were right." I didn't respond immediately. About what I asked. He let out a small about the structure, about how I set it up. I held his gaze. "You didn't leave yourself room for anything else," I said. He nodded slowly. "That's how I've always worked." "I know." Another pause. Not uncomfortable. Just complete. "I underestimated you," he said. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't softened. Just direct. "I know," I replied. A faint smile crossed his face, brief, almost reflexive. "I don't think I understood what you were actually doing," he added. "That wasn't an accident." He almost laughed at that. Clearly, we both knew there was more that could be said. About the relationship. About the way it ended. About everything in between. We didn't go there, because none of it would change anything that mattered now. "I hope it works out," he said finally. "For you." "It already has," I replied. He nodded once, then stepped aside. Just enough space for me to walk past him without brushing shoulders. And that was it. No dramatic ending, no final confrontation. Just two people who had seen each other clearly and chosen different directions. Later that night, back in my apartment, I sat by the window with a glass of water and thought about everything that had happened. Not the details, not the timeline, just the shift. How easy it is to mistake attention for respect. How quickly someone can position you without ever raising their voice. And how long it can take to realize you've been standing in a role you didn't choose. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel like I needed to win anything back. What I felt was steady, like something had settled into place that didn't depend on anyone else recognizing it. I had boundaries now, not the kind you announce, the kind you keep, and that made all the difference. There's something I've learned from all of this. Being underestimated doesn't always feel like an insult at first. Sometimes it feels like an invitation to prove yourself, to stretch, to become something bigger in someone else's eyes. But that's not the same as growth. Real growth doesn't come from trying to meet someone else's standard. It comes from understanding your own and refusing to negotiate it down. If you've ever been in a situation where someone quietly positioned you as less capable, less valuable, less aware, you don't need to fight them to change it. You don't need to expose everything or tear anything down. Sometimes the strongest move is to step out of the structure entirely, to choose clarity over validation, to let consequences unfold without forcing them. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting someone back into the same space they once controlled. And closure doesn't always come with an apology. Sometimes it comes from realizing you don't need one. If any part of this story felt familiar, I'd really like to hear your perspective. Where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? And if you've ever had to walk away from something that looked right on the surface but felt wrong underneath, what helped you trust that instinct? And if you want more stories like this, real, reflective, and grounded in the choices we all have to make at some point, consider staying with the channel. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.